IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we discuss the story of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners. Hi guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories. Hope you're all well and keeping safe. On the podcast today, we speak with a good friend, Ayush Khanna, as we go back in time and speak about a watershed moment in India's history, a place at the heart of these events, and how Ayush is connected to that place. So let's hop onto the episode and find out more. So, with that introduction, we'd love to welcome a fellow traveler and friend, Ayush Khanna, to the Musafir Stories. Hey, Ayush, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the Musafir Stories podcast and welcome.
Hi, Saif. Thank you very much for having me.
Glad to have you, Ayush. And like we were just chatting before our recording, it's been a while. Ayush and I actually first met, Ayush Faiza and I actually first met on one of the many walks around Bangalore, these heritage walks around Bangalore that we used to take part, usually as a part of Sahapedia, I think, but even otherwise. And we have to thank Sujata, ma'am, I think, for
Right.
making this happen. So that's where our first interaction started, and really, really glad to have Ayush on the podcast today. But Ayush, before we jump into the conversation and talk a little bit more, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and your interests as well?
Sure, Saif. Thank you. So, as you described, I'm a traveler. I love traveling to new places. And I have a specific focus on history and culture when I visit these places. So, I like to explore their history and I like to write about it. So, I've started a blog called White Lotus Style where I write about these places and how the history of those places continues to play out in the present.
We'll definitely make sure to include links to Ayush's blog as well in the show notes, so all our listeners can check it out. And I personally am very eagerly looking forward to our conversation today as well, Ayush, especially having had these conversations with you in the past and also following your posts on social media, etc. Really looking forward to where you're taking us to today on the podcast. So, without much ado, tell us a little bit more about the point of interest and the place or the places that you'll be covering today.
Yeah, so I'll be talking to you about Kanpur and Lucknow. And the reason
Okay.
why I wanted to talk to you about these two cities is that although there's a lot of value in visiting a place for the first time, and it opens up so many new experiences and learnings for you as a traveler. But with Kanpur and Lucknow, my relationship is different in the sense that these are two cities that I have been visiting every summer vacation as a child. And when you visit a place again and again, and you reacquaint your relationship with those places again and again, you establish a different kind of a relationship with those places. It's less like peeling an onion than making it. Every time you visit it, a new layer gets added to your relationship with the place, and that is what I feel about my relationship with these two cities. That it's deeper than visiting a place for the first time, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about these two cities. And
Yeah.
that is one
Mm-hmm.
reason. The other reason, of course, is that when it comes to Kanpur, especially, the city tends to be in the news for all the wrong reasons.
Sure.
It's either the place where the Ganga is the most polluted, or
Mm-hmm.
it is the place where the air pollution is the worst, or it is the place where load shedding is a huge problem and there are power cuts for hours on end. So it's in the news for all the wrong reasons, and I thought that I could perhaps show you and the listeners a different side of Kanpur, because I have never heard in all my time of talking to travelers of someone saying that, I'm taking some time off from work and I'm going to Kanpur. It just never happens. It's not one of those places you go to. But if by some quirk of fate you or the listeners find yourself in the city, hopefully something I can tell you can make you see a different side of it.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Ayush. And I completely agree, especially places like you said, right? You've been visiting every summer vacation, like even like we colloquially say, the Nanial or the Dadial, right?
Right.
So looking to hear more from you as to how your experiences have been and what are the different things about these places that you've unearthed over your several visits there. Just adding a little bit more in terms of context setting to listeners who might not know, right? Obviously, Lucknow is a little bit more popular of the two, so people might know, but just geographically, would you like to set some context as to where these two are situated to?
Sure. So these two cities are just 80 kilometers away from each other. They are twin cities, and they are in central Uttar Pradesh. Kanpur is on the banks of the Ganga. Lucknow is on the banks of the Gomti River. These two cities have been a part of the erstwhile Awadh kingdom, but after the mutiny, of course, all of Awadh was controlled by the British.
Yeah, and definitely, I think that's a good segue as well. Talking a little bit more about the historical context of the two places, also, and the different threads that connected them, and how they kind of separated or not separated. They went in their own trajectories after the mutiny, right? That's also an important piece of the whole puzzle. Let's discuss that a little bit more, Ayush, because historically these two places are quite significant, right? And obviously the 1857 revolt or the first war of independence, as we call it, that's an important connecting thread for the two cities as well. Would you like to touch a little bit upon that and the histories associated to these places?
Yeah, sure, Seth. So the mutiny was the most seminal moment in the histories of both Kanpur and Lucknow. I mean, it was the case in most cities where it played a role, but especially so for Kanpur and Lucknow. It's the most watershed moment. Nothing comes close, not even 1947. There's a pre-mutiny and post-mutiny story to both the cities. Let me just begin with Kanpur briefly talking about what things were like pre-mutiny. So in Kanpur, in the 1770s, the British took control of the city after the Battle of Buxar, when the Awadh kingdom was reduced in size. Kanpur went to the British and they established their garrison there. So up until the mutiny, it was a garrison city for the East India Company. And Lucknow, on the other hand, was still controlled by the Nawabs. So Kanpur had the British garrison, and the best person to read, I think, about pre 1857 Kanpur, I think, would be Fanny Parks, who was a very spirited woman who traveled across North India, often alone, in the late 1820s and early 1830s, and she has left a first-hand account of what Kanpur was like at the time. She spent time both in Kanpur and Lucknow, and if anyone is interested in knowing what North India was like at that time, hers is a very good first-hand account. So Kanpur was there was an Indian side, there was an Indian residential area, and there was a British residential area where the East India Company officials and their families lived. The civil lines were getting established, and so on. So leading up to the mutiny, that was what Kanpur was, a garrison town. I mean, it had a history before the British came. It was a smaller village called Kanhepur, but it was only after the British came that things really started changing rapidly for Kanpur. And Bithur, on the other hand, is also very important to Kanpur's story because Bithur was where, before the mutiny, the erstwhile Peshwa, the Maratha Peshwa, was exiled. So the British, Saif, they did this all the time. They they won battles, they deposed rulers, and they sent those rulers to different parts of the world or the country so that they would be away from their traditional power bases. They sent the king of Burma to coastal Maharashtra. They sent
Yeah.
the last Mughal, Bahadur Shah Zafar, to Burma. And after the defeat of the Marathas, the Peshwa was deposed and exiled to Bithur. Bithur is also on the banks of the Ganga. It's very close to Kanpur. And Bithur is where Nana Rao was. So Nana Rao is a very important person for Kanpur when it comes to 1857 because he was the adopted heir of the Peshwa. The problem that Nana Rao faced was, in some sense, similar to the problem that the Rani of Jhansi faced leading up to 1857, which was that the British were not recognizing him as a legitimate heir to the Peshwa.
Right.
And that meant that he would not be eligible for the pension that the East India Company was giving the Peshwa. And this was why, leading up to 1857, he had become a very dangerous figure for the British because he was this disgruntled man who had by then built up some sort of a local support. And when 1857, when the mutiny began and the uprising started to spread, he saw different options for him opening up. So that was what Kanpur was looking like as 1857 approached.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an important call out, and also, obviously, the 57 mutiny started off with Meerut, but
Right.
Kanpur turned out to be one of the turning points of the mutiny as well, right? And also the kind of actions taken by Nana Saheb, as well as the repercussions those had, those also left like quite the significant impact. So please walk us through that a little bit more, and what the important places as well were in that lead up to the conflict, and then obviously the reaction to that by the Britishers, etc. Ayush, if you can, please.
Sure, Saif. So, what I'll do is I'll just tell you a story, so just bear with me. But this story sort of connects all the areas and places in Kanpur connected to 1857. So, I feel that it'll do a very good job of linking all these places in one go.
Yeah, definitely.
So, a couple of years back, I was at my grandparents' place and I was booking a cab for Lucknow, an outstation cab, and I noticed something very odd, which was that the street adjacent to the house was named Baron Carlo Marochetti Road. Now,
Okay.
I found this very odd because I expected it to have a formal name. We knew it as Dudwali Gali because that's where there was a cow shed where we used to get our milk from. But I did not expect like an Italian sounding name, that to a baron and all. So I got curious and I started looking for this person. And looking for this person sort of revealed his connection to the city as well as his connection with all other parts of the city that were affected by the mutiny. So when 1857 happened, when the mutiny began in Kanpur, all the British were put in what is known as the Wheeler's entrenchment. Wheeler's entrenchment is named after General Hugh Wheeler, who was the leader of the Kanpur garrison at the time. Now, this entrenchment was what was the focus of Nana Rao's attack in 1857. So Nana Rao had joined the rebels because he was disgruntled, as we discussed, and his rebels were constantly attacking the entrenchment. The British held out for a surprisingly long amount of time, for 15 days, but their situation was really, really bad. They were low on food, water, people were dying of diseases. It was a horrible situation. Most books, historical fiction books that I've read on the mutiny, they discuss the siege of the Wheeler's entrenchment. Books like Zamindar by Valerie Fitzgerald, for example. And it was a very difficult situation for them. So they were forced to sue for some sort of an agreement with Nana Rao. And the agreement was that they would be given safe passage to British controlled Allahabad. And the only condition was that they need to vacate Kanpur. So these close to 500 British men, women, and children, they were taken to what was then known as Sati Chaura Ghat, where these boats were prepared for their passage to Allahabad. And the men were put on the boats first. They boarded the boats first. And when these boats reached the middle of the river, the rebels who were on the banks, they opened fire on the boats. And you can imagine the scene because there would have been British women and children on the banks witnessing this. There were British men, jumping out of the boats trying to save their lives, and rebels on horseback entering the river trying to cut them down. And only 3 British men escaped that because the Ganga had taken their boat further downstream. And it is from their accounts that we know a lot of what happened during the mutiny at the time. So this Massacre Ghat, of course, is still there. It has a temple, and given the incident that took place then, it's completely haunted, as you can imagine.
Sure.
Lots of ghost stories around it. And that incident then led to the remaining women and children who were there. They were taken to what is known as Bibighar.
Mm-hmm.
So Bibighar was a place in the civil lines where Nana Rao had kept these women and children, and the understanding was that he had kept them there because he wanted to use them as a bargaining chip with the other British forces who would come to attack Kanpur. But clearly something changed. I think they understood that this was not going to work. The strategy wasn't going to work. Because then a decision was taken, a fateful decision was taken to kill all the women and children in Bibighar. They were
Mm-hmm.
around close to 200 in all. And when they were killed, their bodies were dumped in a nearby well. Now, this well, it now forms what is a part of Nana Rao Park in Kanpur.
Okay. Okay.
When the British came, they were expected to relieve the women and children, but instead they found remnants of very gory murder in that house in
Mm-hmm.
Bibighar. And then they learned of the fact that all their bodies had been dumped in the well. No event in the mutiny affected and traumatized the British as much as the massacre in Bibighar.
Mm-hmm.
They were enraged to the point where they used that as a pretext to suspend the rule of law, and they executed anybody who in Kanpur who could not account for their whereabouts during the two massacres.
Mm-hmm.
That meant that thousands of people were killed without any due process or anything of that sort. They were, sepoys who had defected were blown from cannons, and it was a very
Yeah.
just Kanpur in those months saw a lot of bloodshed. So the well where the British women and children were, their bodies were thrown, that ground was consecrated almost as sacred ground in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So Lady Canning, who was the wife of the then Governor General Lord Canning, she decided that there needs to be a memorial built here to commemorate the dead. And she had known the wife of this Baron Carlo Marochetti in Paris when they were children. And as
Mm-hmm.
a result, he was appointed to make that sculpture. So this sculpture is basically that of an angel. It's an angel made out of white marble. The angel is holding two palm leaves across its chest, and it's looking mournfully down on the well on which it was placed.
Mm-hmm.
And this angel, the statue of the angel, as well as the carved barricades around the angel, they were together known as the Kanpur Memorial. This Kanpur Memorial was visited by Europeans in the 19th century more than the Taj Mahal was. It left such a deep impact on the British, and even successive literature that emerged from the Raj that was influenced by what happened in Kanpur at the time. But in 1947, when India gained independence, and by the way, this Kanpur Memorial, right, it was
Mm-hmm.
completely paid for by Indians, by people in Kanpur, through punitive taxes. Some 30,000 rupees in that time's money was
Mm-hmm.
raised for making the Kanpur Memorial, but no Indian was allowed to visit it. It was completely secluded and meant only for European eyes. So in that sense, this the Kanpur Memorial it reflected their collective grief, but it was also a symbol of their triumph in the mutiny.
Yeah.
Which meant that when 1947 happened and India gained independence, one of the first things that the people of Kanpur did was to reclaim that space. They entered that
Sure.
space. They removed the Kanpur Memorial from there, and they placed it in All Souls Church, which is a church in the cantonment area in Kanpur. It's a beautiful church. So if you happen to be in Kanpur, please do visit it. It's a colonial church which was built specifically to commemorate the victory in 1857. And it's the only such church built during that time. So that just gives you an idea of how important Kanpur was to 1857 and what happened then. So Kanpur Memorial now actually stands in the church land,
Okay.
and it's not in the original place where the British had placed it. That place is now part of, as I mentioned, Nana Rao Park, it's called now,
Mm-hmm.
after the man who must have given the order for the killing of the women and children. And it also has other statues of freedom fighters there. So through this story, I just wanted to, when I found out about this Baron and then found out that he had sculpted the Kanpur Memorial, I was from my discussion with friends and relatives who live in the city, they also don't know about it. I think this is just something that we don't go over a lot. The way
Yeah.
decolonization took place in Kanpur, it was quite surface level,
Hmm.
and the fact that this park was renamed in this way, and the fact that the Italian sounding name of the road was just left because
Yeah.
people maybe didn't make the connection with why that name is there today.
Yeah. Yeah, who would have thought Dudwali Gali has so much underneath, right, in terms of the connections and the stories. But yeah, just fascinating, right? Obviously, some of these stories are horrific in the sense of the massacres and everything involved, but
Yeah.
really, like you said, watershed moments in history and specifically the 1857 mutiny.
Yeah.
Um, in
Because
the,
remember, Kanpur became a
yeah,
slogan for the British after that. I
yeah,
mean, not
yeah,
just limited to Kanpur, it was used as a justification for ruthlessly quelling the mutiny across the Gangetic Plain.
yeah. Remember Kanpur
Yeah,
apparently was war cry
yeah.
during that mutiny. But yeah, really, really significant that what I was going to say earlier was that in our really superficial touch on this subject during our academics, I don't know, perhaps in one of our grades in school, not a lot goes into this, but yeah, if you dig deep down, there's definitely a lot more in terms of connections and stories that'll make reading up something about this like so much more interesting, right? And also the Kanpur Memorial from where it was initially to where it is now, etc. The story actually gives like a good connection and background about that too. So thank you for calling it out. And also, just wanted to touch upon Bithur, right? Like you mentioned, very significant in that Nana Saheb or Nana Rao was placed there
Mm.
right after in exile. But while looking it up, I saw that it was even very popular from a religious perspective, and before that, because it's believed to be the birthplace of Love and Kush, the children of Ram. So that way also, Bithur Ganga, as they call it, the banks, very very. Significant to from a religious perspective as well was what I was trying to touch upon. But anyway, that's really interesting from the perspective of Kanpur. And in the meantime, how would you like to quickly portray a picture of what's going on in Lucknow during this time, Ayush?
Yeah, sure, Saif. So in Lucknow, what happened? Let me just talk about pre-mutiny briefly, and then we'll talk about
Mm-hmm.
the mutiny itself. So pre-mutiny, what's happening in Lucknow is that at the time when Kanpur becomes a garrison city for the British, Lucknow, on the other hand, is seeing its Nawabi phase, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we associate with Lucknow traditionally even today. So
Yep.
what started this actually is an interesting incident, which is, well, not an incident, but an interesting sort of a relationship, which is that it was only when Asif-ud-Daula moved from Faizabad to Lucknow, Lucknow's Nawabi era started in a sense. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason he moved to Lucknow was actually because his mother, Bahu Begum, was a very powerful woman. And he kind of felt stifled under her shadow. He wanted to be his own man. He didn't want her to control what he was doing. And she was very powerful in Faizabad. She owned a lot of land. She was a very wealthy woman. So he decided to move to Lucknow to gain some sort of an autonomy. And that moved Lucknow of Asaf-ud-Daula in 1775 or thereabouts, I think, 1770s. That began the Nawabi era of Lucknow because Asif-ud-Daula is now focusing on Lucknow, right? He
Yeah.
now wants to make Lucknow the premier city of India at the time, and he builds a lot of what we now associate with Lucknow and what we commonly know with regards to Lucknowi architecture, right? Like the Bada Imam Bada is famous,
Sure.
then the Chota Imam Bada, the Rumi Darwaza. These are iconic structures of Lucknow that were built by Asaf-ud-Daula. And in fact, they used to say of him, because the building of the Imambada is supposed to have started during a period of famine.
Yeah.
They say of him that jisko na de Maula, usko de Asaf-ud-Daula.
Yeah.
That is the saying in Lucknow. Even today, people remember it.
Yeah.
And that that was associated with him because of the construction works that he began as a means of uh, addressing the famine, at least beginning to address it. So he is a very important figure in Lucknow's history. And leading up after Asafudullah, you had several Nawabs, series of Nawabs, leading up to the other very famous Nawab of Lucknow. I mean, we know Wajid Ali Shah, right? We know
Sure.
him as the last Nawab of Lucknow, and
Hmm.
Wajid Ali Shah had only about 10 years as the Nawab of Lucknow, because then the mutiny happened. So he became Nawab around the late 1840s, 47, 48, and then in 56 he was deposed and sent to Calcutta.
Right.
That is the story of Lucknow leading up to the mutiny itself. And we can talk about what happens once the mutiny began.
Yeah, I mean, Lucknow, and it's. I mean, you could call Asafudullah as the architect of Lucknow, right? Because although even before that, it has been a place of importance. It's just that didn't get as much attention. And once he decided to move the capital, that's when all of the architectural marvels that we see today, those came into the picture with Asafudullah, starting with him, and went on from Nawab to Nawab after him. But in terms of the mutiny, obviously, like we called out, Kanpur was like a watershed moment. But what were the implications in Lucknow as a part of this mutiny, Ayush?
Yeah. So the contrast between the two cities and the impact of the mutiny on the two cities is quite stark, actually, because in Kanpur the mutiny led to the establishment of Kanpur as the Manchester of the East. They used to call Kanpur because manufacturing took off in a big way. But in Lucknow, the memory of 1857 is very different. The memory of 1857 is one of a decline, of tragedy, because it brought to end the Nawabi era of Lucknow, when and everything we associate with Lucknow sort of stops. Then it's like a year that brought it all to a standstill, and then from that period onwards, it just continued to decay. And this is not to say that the city didn't grow. Of course, it grew in other ways, but what we associate with the city, like for example, I was talking about Wajid Ali Shah. Wajid Ali Shah in his last years, this dreamland that he was building, this palace complex of his, which we know as Kaisar Bagh, that was supposed to be a very beautiful palace complex in Lucknow. And after the mutiny happened, there were it's almost as if the British took out their anger of the mutiny on some of these structures in Lucknow, because this Kaisar Bagh complex was treated in such a horrible manner. There were roads made in the middle of the palace complex, and all sorts of demolitions took place. And even today, some parts of Kaisar Bagh still exist. And out of nowhere, you'll see this beautiful structure in Lucknow, and you'll not have any idea of what that used to be a part of, a part of a larger complex. But that's what it has done. The British then used these structures in a very haphazard manner, treated them very badly, demolished them at in random ways. The Lucknow as a city itself was traumatized by the mutiny, because a lot of the people actually left the city as a result of the turmoil and the tumult that was happening. My family included, actually. The
Okay.
family home that we have in Lucknow, in Old Lucknow, in the Chowk area, that home was vacated, and the whole family left, just like so many others did. In fact, there's a film by Shashi Kapoor called Junoon, and Junoon captures this period, the tumult of 1857 in Lucknow. So anyone interested should watch it. And there's a scene where everyone is leaving Lucknow at the end. So that's what happened. Actually, it was just a very turbulent sort of an event. And what happened after the mutiny is, there were other sorts of growth that took place, because the British came and they established different sorts of institutions, and those things continued, those trends continued. But what we associate with Lucknow, in terms of its architecture, that ended with the Nawabi era. And Even though, of course, the city continues to grow because it's the capital of modern day Uttar Pradesh, Nawabi architecture itself is most of it is disappearing quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely sad. And also, like, it's always interesting to see how different trajectories both of these cities took right after the mutiny. And I'm actually kind of still surprised by the amount of industrialization that Kanpur went through in that duration after the mutiny as well. And still, one of the, I guess, identifying features of Kanpur is the industries and especially the textiles and the tanneries, even today, right?
Mm,
Like you said, almost set out to be called as the Manchester of the East.
yeah,
A lot of the structures also, right, these big mills that came up after. On one hand, like I said, Lucknow is recognized by these Nawabi architecture and the structures they built during that time, but for Kanpur, a lot of the ones, the beautiful structures I do see is in this era, right? That came up in this era. Things like the Elgin Mill and
yeah,
the popular Lalimli Mill, I
Lalimli,
think, right, is
yeah,
also very beautiful. When you take a closer look and a closer lens at events and how they panned out for two different cities and not even like separated by 100 kilometers, right? The two of
yeah,
them. It's really interesting to see it through that lens.
yeah.
So thank you for kind of calling that out, Ayush. Let's take a quick commercial break here and we'll be right back on the other side. All right, we are back from the commercial break talking to Ayush Khanna about Kanpur and Lucknow and how he spent time visiting those places and covering off some milestone events connected to these places and more. And Ayush, if there's any additional structures within these two cities, I know there's no dearth of important structures, especially in Lucknow, but any ones of important that you'd like to call out?
Yeah. So in Lucknow, for example, there are many, despite the decline, there are many structures that are worth visiting, you know. One of them I would recommend is one that I visited only on the last occasion that I went to Lucknow, which is this kothi called Kothi Roshan Uddaula. So this kothi is very
Mm-hmm.
interesting because it was made by someone who's a bit idiosyncratic in the sense that usually, you know, with Lucknowi Nawabi architecture, there's a sense of symmetry that is explained by this phrase called Sawal
Sure.
Jawab, where if you have, you know, like a
Mm.
minaret somewhere, then the opposite end of it you will have another minaret as a Jawab. That
Oh,
suggests
wow.
a kind of symmetry in the architecture, you know. But the man who built Kothi Roshan Uddaula decided to completely do away with that. You know, he's like, I don't believe in all this.
Mm.
I'm just going to make something, and it's still an extremely impressive structure. It's so beautiful, but it doesn't follow that symmetrical pattern that you usually associate. So, just to look at something different, which is nonetheless Nawabi, I would suggest Kothi Roshan Uddaula for sure. Just take a look at it. That is one. The other is, of course, the much better known residency where the British resident lived. This was built by the Nawabs for the British resident, so it was made in the British style. But
Mm.
it's a very haunting place. I mean, I just enjoy going there because I like the fact that they haven't tried to build it back in a way. You know, it's just left almost like it was at the end of the mutiny. It feels like that with the bullet holes and the
Mm.
cannon holes and so on. And there are other Nawabi structures in Lucknow which don't have the same prestige as, you know, something like a Bada Imam Bada. But I hope that the government does
Mm-hmm.
pay more attention to them in maintaining them because they are disappearing at a fast rate. There is one known as the Kala Imam Bada, and it it I mean it's called that because it's made out of black stone, and even today people are confused about what purpose it served, you know, apart from the fact that its color is so distinctive. The fact is that so many Nawabs were often idiosyncratic about how they wanted to spend their money that they built structures that sometimes were not even completed and just left half finished
Mm.
sometimes. That almost adds to Lucknow's architecture and charm in a sense. One very important structure in Lucknow, which I won't call Nawabi, but it was built by Claude Martin, which is La Martiniere College. It's the most famous college in Lucknow. It's school really. Most of my cousins have studied there, and it was built by Claude Martin, who was initially a part of the French East India Company, but he was very bright and he understood which way the winds were blowing, and he joined the English East India Company, and made a fortune for himself. How, we don't know, but he did, and he built this structure, what is today La Martiniere College. And in fact, Claude Martin is buried in La Martiniere College. So
Okay.
you can go down. It's really a tomb, I can call it. And you can even see copies of his will around around the tomb.
Interesting.
And La Martiniere is very different from the rest of Lucknow's architecture, because it isn't, like I said, Nawabi, right? It is
Yeah.
very strongly influenced. It's very strongly influenced by European architecture. So is Nawabi architecture, to be honest. The Nawabs themselves wanted to import a lot of European influences into the architecture, but this has very few Indian influences, La Martiniere College. And one very interesting thing about La Martiniere College is that this is where William Hodgson is buried.
Okay.
So William Hodgson is a very important figure in the mutiny of 1857, because he not only raised the regiment that was then known as Hodgson's Horse, which today is also a part of the Indian Army in a different avatar, but he is also the man who killed Bahadur Shah Zafar's two sons and one grandson.
Right.
So he's the man who was responsible for that, and he died later in Lucknow in Bibi Ki Kothi, I think it's called, which is a structure that doesn't exist anymore. But Hodgson's story is very interesting because William Hodgson was someone who was fairly clear about how ruthless he was in quelling the mutiny and the way he went about it. But what is interesting is the way his legacy is used by La Martiniere today, which is to say that, now there's a house in his name. There's a run. The children go on a run in his name. There's a wreath laying ceremony now. Nothing around the structure, around the grave of William Hodgson, indicates that he was the one who was responsible for killing the last Mughal princes of India. So just goes to show that I think when we use history in this way, to legitimize the present, we do it in ways that work for us.
Yeah.
We don't use it we don't view it in the fullness of the past. Is one thing you can see clearly from William Hodgson's story. He was also instrumental in the establishment of another famous school in India, which is Lawrence School, Sanawar, and they also remember him very fondly, without mentioning the fact that he was responsible for the death of the last Mughal princes.
Yeah.
So it tells you a lot when you look at his story and the way his memory is used in the present.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thank you for calling that out as well, Ayush. Ayush, any other interesting stories from your visits there, especially to Kanpur and the areas and the vicinity that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so there's this one graveyard that I wanted to talk about, which is what people call Gora Kabristan.
Okay.
So Gora Kabristan is called Gora Kabristan because it's where white people are buried, and it's a very old cemetery, actually, almost as old as the famous South Calcutta cemetery, where
South Park. Yeah.
South Park Cemetery in Calcutta, where a lot of famous people are buried, like William Jones and Henry Derozio and so on. So the Kanpur Cemetery doesn't have such famous names, but it is almost equally old, and it has the architecture of the graves are very similar. The Indo-Saracenic architecture is very similar to the South Park Cemetery. And one interesting story that is associated with the cemetery is that if you go there at night time, there's a ghost story among the locals is that you might encounter a headless Englishman
Oh God.
In Hindi, they say he's a sarkata Angrez.
Uh-huh.
All he'll do is that he'll ask you for a cigarette. He has no head, but he will ask you for a cigarette. so
Oh my God.
so
Yeah.
I want to know. I actually want to dig more into this story. I want to know, is this association with 1857? It must be,
Mm.
but I this is what I know about the story. It's associated with the Gora Kabristan,
Yeah.
and
And
the other one is that there is the story of a Sufi. So
mhm.
Kanpur also has Sufi dargahs,
Okay.
and close to my home there are two, which are separated by a distance of about a couple of kilometers. And it is said that on some nights, one Sufi rides his white horse and visits the other Sufi, in the other dargah, and you should not come in front of this Sufi or try and stop him because he will slap you. That's all he'll do. so so
Oh
just
my God.
give him way and don't trouble him. My aunt swears to have seen the Sufi ride on his horse, and she no amount of teasing her about it will change her mind that she saw him. This is the story I wanted to share with regards to Sufi ghost stories.
My God, yeah, very eerie, and I'm happy to give it a pass, and not looking for encounters either with a headless Englishman asking for a cigarette or a Sufi riding his horse. But yeah, some of these local stories also make visits and the experience worthwhile, I guess, right? Obviously, you like to hear them rather than experience and see them more. But yeah, just fascinating stories. So thank you for sharing those with us, Ayush. Now, before we jump on to other topics, one of the very, very integral part of the culture here, right, or especially around in this area, is the food of the area as well. So, would you like to touch upon a few of the, I guess, unique things, both from culinary perspective of not just Kanpur but also Lucknow, Ayush?
Yeah, sure. So Lucknow is a lot more famous, right, in terms of its
Yeah.
association again with Nawabi culinary culture. And for that reason, its biryani is one of the more famous biryanis in India. You have the Hyderabadi
Hmm.
biryani, you have you the biryanis in the south now, but Lucknow biryani has also made a place for itself in this list. And there are a
Yeah.
few distinctive places. I mean, there are a few famous places you can go to. In Old Chalk, there are two places where I usually go for my biryani. One is Idris ki biryani. It's in Chalk. It's excellent. I don't know how else to describe it. There's also Lalla Ki biryani, which is also in Chowk. Lalla Ki biryani happens to be closer to our home, so I go there more often. But both are very very good. So these two places should be tried out. The other place is that it's actually a home kitchen.
Hmm.
It's run by this person called Shiba Iqbal. So I'm excited about this new trend that has begun in Lucknow, which is that people have started realizing that this heritage is an important one, this culinary heritage, and they're beginning to share it with people. So Shiba Iqbal is one such person will whose home you can go to, and and her home is also in Chowk. Actually, it's just behind Idris ki Biryani, so that makes it
Mm.
easy, although it makes it difficult to decide which place to go to. But Shiba's food, I mean, my brother and I went there last time we were there, and uh, some of the distinctive food that she made was, the shirmal that is eaten in Lucknow. It's like a flat bread, but
Sure.
it comes in very different flavors. The keema matar that she made was outstanding, and she takes care of making sure that there's enough vegetarians as well, even though meat is what Lucknow is famous for. The other thing is that
Yeah.
there's one particular dessert which you get in Lucknow, which is known as Kali Gajar ka halwa, which is
Mm.
very different from the usual red or orange carrot halwa that you get, right? It's
Right.
it's made out of black carrot. It's more purple actually, but it's called Kali Gajar ka halwa, and yeah, she made that as well, which was very very good because it's not too sweet or anything. And this Kali Gajar Kalwa you get in other shops in Chowk as well. I haven't eaten it in other cities. I'm guessing there are other cities that make it in UP, but I've had it in Old Lucknow, especially. So that is one dish you should look out for when you're there next. And there's another thing, another in sort of a I think it's a restaurant, but what it does is it basically brings together different cooks from across Lucknow and their food at one place, which is Nehmat Khana. Nehmat
Okay.
Khana is in Kaisar Bagh that we discussed earlier, and it is where you can go and you can sit and you can eat food from different homes in Lucknow. I think that's a fabulous concept. They have an Instagram page,
Yeah.
so whoever's interested should just look up Nehmat Khana on Instagram. And yeah, Lucknow's food is amazing. I There are no two ways about it. There's lots of different people will point you to different places, based on their own interests, and there's so many of them. Like
Sure.
uh, Bajpayee's chai is also quite famous. I mean, imagine just tea becoming famous, but I mean, even the assorted snacks that he serves along with it is quite famous. Shukla chaat is famous. So these are some very popular places in Lucknow where you can go to for food. In Kanpur, on the other hand, there is a lot of excellent chaat, which is most famous in Kanpur. And
Sure.
besides chaat, there is also this place called Thaggu Ki Kulfi. So
Oh yes.
Thaggu Ki Kulfi is actually featured in a couple of Bollywood films also. Bunty or
Yeah.
Bubbly, I think. Although I haven't watched Bunty or
Yeah.
Bubbly, but I know for a fact that it became very popular in Kanpur because Thaggu Ki Kulfi featured in it.
Yeah. ऐसा कोई
नहीं
सगा
जिसको
नहीं
हमने
जिसे
ठगा नहीं.
जिससे हमने
So
ठगा नहीं.
that's his tagline
Yeah.
even today. And people love the fact that, these people can be so brazen about uh,
Yeah.
the way they advertise their food. But it's excellent because the kind of kulfi he makes is not the traditional, in the freezer. Actually, it is the traditional way of making it. So if you go there, you'll see this guy constantly rotating this metal container in which the kulfi is made, uh, and it's really really good too. And so are his
Yeah. I
samosas and
believe
so
it's
on.
called as a Badnam Kulfi
Yeah, yeah,
apparently.
yeah. They do all
That's what
that.
it's called.
And the other tagline that they
Yeah.
use is "Mehman ko mat chakhana, tik jayega."
Yeah, I think that's the Kanpurga attitude also, I guess,
Right,
right?
right,
They're
right.
very popular for very
Yeah,
brazen and to the point.
that's right.
So that's really nice to see at these food places as well. But yeah, I'm sorry, you were saying something about the samosa?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Their samosas are also just one of the best I've had, honestly. So the other thing about Kanpur I want to point out is that I have uh, e- like probably not eaten better vegetables. Just the just the normal vegetables that you eat as an everyday part of your food. The flavor that Kanpur's vegetables have, it just seems to be different somehow, and I hope it's nothing to do with how toxic the river is there. But
Yeah.
it just is really really good, when you see the Ganga and you see the white banks of the Ganga on in Kanpur, and that's where most of the vegetables are coming from, that white alluvial soil. Maybe it has something to do with the soil there, but it's just that fruits and vegetables taste like nowhere I've had before. And uh, I think that a lot of these nameless varieties of fruits as well, they need to get more attention because we focus so much on the mango, and even the mango from these parts is very famous. The cherry mango that comes from Malihabad,
Sure.
especially. Malihabad is close to Kanpur and Lucknow. It's famous for its mango
Yeah.
orchards and the dasheri mango that grows there. But there's this variety of guava that I love from Kanpur, and you'll get it almost throughout the year. Uh, it has these red spots. I don't think it has a name because I've asked around and no one seems to know. No one seems to give it a specific name. It just is the guava that you get in Kanpur and Bithur. But its flavor is really, really good. So if you go to Kanpur, make sure you try the guava there. And the
Interesting.
other food experience that I want to mention is that if you travel from Kanpur to Lucknow by road, you come across closer to Lucknow, in fact, you come across near the Nawabganj Bird Sanctuary. There's this dhaba called Ma Jag Janani. So if
Okay.
ever you go to Kanpur, Lucknow, stop at this dhaba because, in my view, this dhaba has the second best gulab jamuns I've ever eaten. And I am a very, very picky gulab jamun eater because it's my favorite sweet. I'm a bit snobbish about it. I don't eat gulab jamun wherever I get it, but the gulab jamun in this dhaba is outstanding. And I make sure that
Yeah.
whenever I go to Kanpur, Lucknow, I go by road. Even when we were kids, I would make sure we go by road and not by train because we can stop at this dhaba and eat some gulab jamuns there and take the rest in a handi to be eaten sparingly later on.
Very interesting, but also begs the question, which is Ayush's favorite or the best gulab jamun?
So the best is also something is a place actually in UP. It's called Megalganj. So it's like a small
Okay.
kasbah. Megalganj is not a place I've been to, but on one of my summer vacations, an uncle who worked in the state department had gone to Megalganj, and all over UP, it's famous. The gulab jamuns from here are famous. That's what this place is famous for, gulab jamuns. And he
Interesting.
brought one handi back just because they were famous. And those cousins of mine who were in Lucknow, they didn't spare any, they didn't spare a thought for their Bangalore cousins who
Yeah.
don't get such gulab jamuns back home. But I've not had such good gulab jamuns since. So that is the number one on my
Yeah.
list.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Well, what is a trip to say Lucknow? And I mean, now we're discovering more about Kanpur as well. But without food, it's like incomplete, right? I would say. And I'm really missing Faiza on this episode. She would have been super excited to be talking more about the different cuisines and especially the sweets and things like that.
Yeah.
It'd been great to have her. But yeah, another time. There's always another time and another episode to cover off food, especially food in Lucknow. Right? There's so much more that you can always do a deep dive into. Any final thoughts, Ayush, before we start to close this down? It's already been such a roller coaster ride, both from the events of history and especially a lot of these darker events that you don't get so much visibility into a lot of times, to things on the lighter side, things like the food, for example, and also in between these, how two cities with connected histories actually went in really two different ways after that watershed moment. So it's really, really interesting. And thank you for calling that out. But any final thoughts, Ayush, before we sort of wrap this up?
Yeah, so in terms of their histories, I feel that, while 1857 was the most important event, you had different kinds of growth that took place in both cities, and I don't want to make it sound as though, one was a stagnant story and the other was a story of industry. It isn't as reductive as that because even in Lucknow, you had a lot of efflorescence of Urdu literature, from people like Kuratulain Haider, Ismat Chugtai, Rashid Jahan. These people studied in places like the ITC University, Isabella Thoburn College of Lucknow University. And so there were lots of different strands of growth that took place. But what I was trying to highlight was the fact that, there is a continuous sense of decline nonetheless because of what we associate as distinctively Lucknow. And also, Kanpur, on the other hand, became a city of workers because of the manufacturing that took place there in Lal Imli and all of that, and it attracted a lot of revolutionary activity in the early 20th century. Bhagat Singh visited Kanpur and stayed there for a while because uh, because that's where the HSRA was based for a time. So there was, in that sense, a difference between the two cities in how they developed after 1857. And partition, I wanted to say, had a huge impact on Lucknow more than Kanpur, because a lot of the gentry, Muslim gentry, lived in Lucknow, right? And they, even the talukdars who lived in, say, rural UP, usually had homes in Lucknow. It affected them quite deeply. It affected the city as a result quite deeply. And yeah, we should have a separate episode on that as well sometime.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. But thank you for capturing Kanpur and Lucknow and your memories associated to these places so beautifully and sharing them with us and enlightening even me personally, right? I know like 1857 Mutiny would be like a chapter in our book, and probably Mangal Pandey, the movie, is what I'd associated to the most. And beyond that, it was very, very superficial. But with this episode, I got a chance to actually dig a little deeper into and learn a little bit more about a lot of these events that happened, the personalities that were associated with it, and also like the implications, the aftermath of it, etc. Right? Even from the East India Company's perspective, it was a watershed because after that point is when
The
the
Raj
British
began.
government
Yeah.
actually, yeah, the Raj began, right? So that was as well a really important milestone in India's journey towards independence. Thank you for shedding so much light on these two very important cities, Ayush.
It was a pleasure, sir. It was a pleasure talking to you.
That was yet another great episode on the Musafir Stories. Make sure to show us some love by sharing the podcast with your friends and family. We are on Instagram and Twitter at Musafir Stories. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or the website. Follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram.